You have no idea who you're messing with. That's what I thought when I heard the crunch of gravel under her boots, creeping closer to my lake cabin. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks. Karen Thompson, the HOA president, was notorious for bullying anyone who didn't fit her idea of perfect in Willowbrook Estates. This time, she'd gone too far. She thought she could walk in, disrupt my peaceful retreat, and get away with it. Little did she know, I wasn't just some guy with a cabin on the lake. I was meeting the state attorney general inside. As I watched her from the window, she didn't notice the lights flickering on inside, didn't hear the shuffle of papers in the next room. The moment was set. I could hear her muttering about the violations she was sure she'd find. She had the bolt cutters ready, thinking she'd steal the chains off my property, make me pay for her absurd rules. But she had no idea I wasn't alone. She moved toward the gate, and with one sharp snip, she cut through the chain. My heart raced. As she stepped inside, I stood up from my chair and greeted her, my voice calm, collected, but every word heavy with the weight of what she was about to face. "I see you've decided to pay a visit," I said, eyes locking onto hers. The shock that hit her face was priceless as the state attorney general stood from his seat behind me. "You're not in control here anymore," I added, watching her scramble for words. I had every right to be here, to meet with whoever I needed to. But Karen's power trip? It ended tonight. I didn't just own this cabin. I owned the power to bring down people like her, people who thought they were untouchable. And she was about to learn the hard way that nobody's untouchable, not when you've got the law on your side. Mark Bennett had never wanted to be the center of attention. A former military man, he preferred the quiet of his lake cabin away from the hustle of city life. It had been his grandfather's land, passed down through generations, a small piece of heaven tucked away from the world. He'd spent his childhood there, running through the woods and fishing by the lake, learning the value of hard work and family. But life had changed. After years of service, he had come back to find a new world, one where HOA rules, regulations, and Karen Thompson were slowly encroaching on his peace. It started small, minor complaints about the grass being a bit too long, the mailbox not quite up to code. But it didn't stop there. Karen, the HOA president, started sending violation after violation. Mark, usually calm and collected, had reached his limit when she sent him a bill for a community improvement project that wasn't even necessary. He could have ignored it, but this wasn't just about the money. It was about his family's legacy, about standing up for what was right. Karen didn't understand the history behind this land, the sweat and blood that had gone into making it what it was. To her, it was just another opportunity to gain control, another place to enforce her will. But Mark wasn't the kind of man to back down. As the weeks passed, the tension grew. He'd received threats, subtle ones, at first. A letter here, a warning there. But he had one thing she didn't, knowledge of the law. While Karen thought she could intimidate him with fines and rules, Mark had studied, learned his rights, and knew exactly how to fight back. And then came the final straw. One morning, he arrived at the cabin to find a group of workers on his land, claiming they had orders from Karen to start improvements. His blood boiled as he walked up to them, already prepared with a plan to stop this nonsense once and for all. This wasn't just about a piece of land or a house. This was his history. His family's legacy. And he wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. But what Mark didn't know was that this confrontation would change everything. The meeting he had planned for the afternoon, one with the state attorney general, was about to become the most important meeting of his life. Little did Karen know, this wasn't just a man she was messing with. This was a man with connections, with power, and someone who wasn't afraid to use it to protect what was his. Mark was about to give Karen a lesson she would never forget. The tension between Mark and Karen had been building for weeks. Every interaction, every letter, every fine felt like another small blow to his patience. But when Karen showed up with a team of contractors, marking his property for an upgrade that had never been approved, it was clear that she had underestimated just how far he was willing to go. Mark was tired of being pushed around, tired of watching her and the HOA take control of what rightfully belonged to him. As the workers began unloading equipment, he knew this was it, this was the moment when he would stand his ground. But Mark had one advantage Karen didn't: knowledge of the law. He had done his homework. Every document, every regulation, every zoning law, it was all in his favor. While Karen thought she was just asserting her power as HOA president, Mark knew exactly how to turn the tables. He walked over to the group of workers, his boots crunching on the gravel, his demeanor calm but unwavering. "I'm afraid you're going to have to pack up and leave," he said, his voice steady. The workers, confused, looked to each other, unsure if they should challenge him. But Mark wasn't just any landowner, he had connections that went far beyond Willowbrook Estates. With a single phone call, he could make sure Karen's little power trip came to an abrupt halt. As he turned to walk toward his cabin, his phone buzzed with a message, one that confirmed everything he had been waiting for. The state attorney general was on his way. Mark had planned this meeting for weeks, but he hadn't expected it to take this turn. He knew the law. He knew how to use it to his advantage. And now, with the right people in his corner, he was ready to strike back. The next few hours would be crucial. Mark could feel the weight of what was coming, but he was ready. He was done playing by the HOA's rules. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, take what was rightfully his. As he stood at the door of his cabin, he heard the familiar sound of a car approaching. He looked out, his heart beating a little faster. This was the moment of reckoning. The Attorney General's car pulled up to the driveway, and Mark felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't over, but he had just gained a powerful ally in his fight against the HOA. Karen had no idea what was coming next. Mark stood at the door, watching the Attorney General's car pull up. His pulse quickened, but he remained composed. This was the turning point. The confrontation with Karen had been building for so long, but now, with the Attorney General arriving, the tables were about to turn. As the car parked, Mark's phone buzzed again. It was a confirmation of what he already knew: this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about stopping an abuse of power. The door opened, and out stepped someone Mark had always admired, someone who had the authority to make things right. The Attorney General, a seasoned professional who had taken on much larger battles, gave Mark a firm handshake. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. Mark led him into the cabin, where they took a seat at the table, papers spread out in front of them. Karen had no idea what was coming. Mark had gathered everything he needed: land records, HOA documents, and the law that protected him. The Attorney General reviewed the materials quickly, nodding as he flipped through the pages. "This is solid," he said, and Mark could see the confidence in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about the documents, he was talking about the case. Mark felt a wave of relief. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and now, with the right legal support, he knew he had a shot at finally putting an end to Karen's reign of terror. Outside, the workers Karen had sent were still hanging around, unsure of what to do now that Mark had made his stance clear. They were getting the message, slowly but surely. But Mark wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. The Attorney General stood up and grabbed his jacket. "Let's go," he said, looking Mark in the eye. "It's time to take action." Mark nodded. They both walked outside to confront Karen, who was pacing back and forth, unaware that her world was about to crumble. The moment she saw them approach, she froze. Her expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. Mark could see the realization hitting her. She didn't know who she was dealing with, and now, it was too late. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. As Mark and the Attorney General approached Karen, the air felt thick with tension. Karen stood frozen, her eyes darting between the two men. She had been confident, too confident, as if she were untouchable. But now, facing the Attorney General, the reality was hitting her. Her posture stiffened as she tried to regain control, but it was too late. Mark could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the realization that this wasn't going to be like the other times when she could bully people into submission. The Attorney General stepped forward, his voice calm but powerful. "Karen, you've overstepped," he said. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "You've used your position to manipulate and intimidate people for far too long," the Attorney General continued. "But this ends now. The law is on their side, not yours." Karen's face flushed red with anger, but there was nothing she could say. Mark stood beside the Attorney General, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. This was it, the moment when the power balance shifted. For years, Karen had thought she could control everything in Willowbrook Estates, but now, Mark had exposed her for who she really was. Her authority was gone, and there was no hiding behind it anymore. "You'll be held accountable for your actions," the Attorney General said, turning his gaze to the workers who had been standing idly by, still unsure of what to do. "All of this, every violation, will be reviewed. And we'll make sure it's corrected." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding. It was clear they weren't used to seeing someone stand up to Karen like this. Mark could feel the power shift with each word. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders started to lift. Karen opened her mouth, probably to protest, but the Attorney General didn't give her the chance. "You've made a lot of mistakes, Karen. And this is where they catch up with you." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood there, seething, but she knew there was nothing she could do. The truth was out, and her reign of terror was coming to an end. As the Attorney General turned to Mark, giving him a reassuring nod, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally in control of his own life again. This was the beginning of something new, not just for him, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. The battle wasn't over, but it was clear Mark had won the first round. Mark stood there, watching as Karen's face twisted in disbelief. The Attorney General had made his point clear, and now there was no turning back for her. The workers, still unsure, were slowly starting to pack up their equipment, their eyes shifting nervously from Mark to the Attorney General. Karen's once firm grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she could feel it. She tried to compose herself, but Mark could see the cracks forming in her armor. "You don't know what you're doing," she spat, her voice filled with venom. But the Attorney General wasn't moved. "I know exactly what I'm doing," he said coolly. "And so do you. You've been abusing your position for too long, and now the law is coming for you." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape, but there was none. The power she had wielded so carelessly was now a heavy burden she could no longer bear. Mark felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. For too long, he had watched her manipulate, control, and bully people in the neighborhood. But now, with the law on his side, he was watching her unravel. This wasn't just about his cabin anymore. It was about standing up for everyone she had trampled over the years. He had done it. He had taken back control. The Attorney General turned to Mark and gave him a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement that the battle wasn't over, but they had won the first round. As they walked away from Karen, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight on his shoulders lighten. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. The fight wasn't over, but he had taken the first step toward restoring the peace that had been stolen from him and the neighborhood. As he glanced back one last time, he saw Karen standing there, defeated, her power completely shattered. She was no longer the formidable force she once was. And Mark knew this was only the beginning of her downfall. As the days passed, the shockwaves of Karen's defeat rippled through Willowbrook Estates. Word spread quickly, and the once feared HOA president was now the subject of whispers and side glances. Mark couldn't help but feel a small sense of justice, though he knew the fight wasn't over. The moment Karen's grip on the neighborhood had faltered, a small part of Mark believed that the calm he longed for might finally be within reach. But even as the tension started to ease, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was just the beginning. Mark had lived through enough battles to know that the first victory was always the easiest. There were still people like Karen who thrived on power, people who would do anything to regain control. He wasn't naive enough to think she would go down quietly. It wasn't long before the HOA's legal team reached out. They had been given a mandate from Karen to fight back, to challenge everything that had happened. But Mark was ready. Armed with evidence, a network of supporters, and the knowledge that he wasn't alone, he met the legal team head-on. His quiet confidence in the courtroom stood in stark contrast to their desperation. They tried to use every trick in the book, pulling strings, twisting laws, but Mark remained calm. Every move they made only further exposed how fragile their case really was. They had underestimated him, and that mistake was about to cost them. Karen, from the sidelines, watched as the tables continued to turn. She could see it in the eyes of the other homeowners who had been quietly watching her reign of terror crumble. They no longer feared her. They had seen what Mark had done, and they realized that maybe, just maybe, they too could stand up for their rights. Mark wasn't just fighting for his cabin anymore, he was fighting for the community he had grown up in, the community that had been suppressed for too long. As he prepared for the final court session, a quiet confidence washed over him. He wasn't afraid of what was to come. He had the law, the truth, and the support of the people. Karen's downfall had started, and it was only a matter of time before it was sealed. Mark knew he was on the right side of history, and this time, he was ready to finish what he had started. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Mark felt a mix of anticipation and determination. The courtroom was quiet, the atmosphere thick with expectation. Mark sat in his seat, papers neatly arranged in front of him. He wasn't just prepared legally, he was prepared emotionally. This had been a long journey, one filled with frustration, anger, and moments of doubt. But now, sitting in the courtroom, he felt a deep sense of resolve. Karen's legal team had come out swinging, but Mark had anticipated every move they would make. They tried to discredit his evidence, questioning the validity of his documents, but it was all in vain. Mark had anticipated their every tactic, and each attempt to tear him down only made him stronger. As the Attorney General took the stand, his words were measured, deliberate. He spoke of the law, of fairness, and of how Karen's actions had disrupted the lives of countless homeowners. He painted a picture of a community torn apart by the very people who were supposed to protect it. The judge listened intently, his gaze shifting between Karen's lawyers and the powerful evidence Mark had presented. For the first time, Mark saw doubt in their eyes. It was clear they hadn't expected the full weight of the law to come down on them. As the session ended and the judge called for a brief recess, Mark exchanged a look with the Attorney General. It was a silent acknowledgement. The end was near. But Karen wasn't giving up without a fight. She stormed out of the courtroom, her face red with frustration. Mark watched her go, but his thoughts were clear. This wasn't about winning in the courtroom, it was about justice. It was about restoring balance. The final session would be the last step, the moment when everything she had built would crumble under the weight of her own lies. And as Mark sat back, watching her retreat, he knew this was it. The truth had finally caught up with her. The final day of the hearing had arrived, and Mark could feel the weight of the moment. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as everyone took their seats, the air thick with anticipation. Mark sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, but his mind was focused, clear. He had seen Karen and her legal team try every trick in the book, each one more desperate than the last. But he wasn't worried. This was the moment that would change everything. As the judge entered and the room fell silent, Mark's thoughts turned back to everything that had led to this. For so long, Karen had been a force in Willowbrook Estates, using her position in the HOA to manipulate, control, and bully others. But now, the law was on Mark's side, and the truth had nowhere left to hide. The Attorney General stood beside him, ready to present the final pieces of evidence that would seal Karen's fate. As the arguments continued, Mark could feel his heart beating a little faster with each passing minute. He watched as Karen's lawyers tried to discredit the evidence again, but their words were faltering. The documents were solid, the facts undeniable. Mark knew that this time, Karen's manipulation wouldn't work. She had overplayed her hand, and now, her empire was crumbling. The final argument was made, and the judge called for a brief recess. Mark walked outside the courtroom for a moment of quiet, letting the cool air settle his nerves. His mind raced, replaying every step of the case, every strategy that had led him to this point. But as he stood there, waiting for the final decision, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done everything right. He had stood up for what was his, and now, the law was about to deliver the justice that had been so long overdue. The sound of footsteps broke his concentration, and he turned to see the Attorney General walking toward him, a slight smile on his face. "It's done," he said. "We've won." The words hit Mark like a wave of relief. The battle was over, and Karen had lost. As they walked back into the courtroom for the final verdict, Mark felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about his cabin anymore, it was about the entire community, about taking a stand against corruption and misuse of power. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and Mark was ready to move forward, knowing he had done the right thing. The courtroom was silent as the judge took his seat, ready to deliver the final ruling. Mark sat in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. The anticipation in the room was palpable, but Mark remained still, his mind focused on the next steps. He had fought hard for this moment, and now it was out of his hands. The Attorney General gave him a reassuring nod, and Mark's nerves eased just slightly. He had prepared for this day, studied every law, every loophole, and every strategy he could use. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the entire community that had been oppressed for so long. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. After reviewing all the evidence presented, the court has made its decision. The room held its breath as the judge glanced at the papers in front of him, then looked up. The actions of Karen Thompson, as president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, have been found to be in violation of the law. Her misuse of power and her attempt to unlawfully take control of private property is not only unethical, but it is also illegal. Mark could hardly believe his ears. It was over. The judge's words confirmed everything he had worked for. The relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming. The battle had been long and tiring, but now, the victory was sweet. Karen's face, pale and tight with anger, said it all. She had never expected this outcome, and now, she had no way out. The judge continued, outlining the consequences for Karen's actions. She would be held accountable for the harm she had caused to Mark and the other residents of Willowbrook Estates. The penalties were harsh, but they were necessary. Karen's reign of power was officially over. Mark allowed himself a moment to take it all in. The years of frustration, the sleepless nights, the constant battle against someone who thought they could control everything, it was all behind him. As the courtroom began to empty, Mark stood up, the weight on his shoulders lifting for the first time in what felt like forever. He turned to the Attorney General, who gave him a quiet smile. "You did it," the Attorney General said. Mark simply nodded, feeling the full weight of the victory sink in. The road had been long, but he had taken a stand. He had fought for what was right, and now, the neighborhood could finally breathe easy again. As he walked out of the courtroom, Mark knew this wasn't just a personal win. It was a victory for anyone who had ever felt powerless. Anyone who had ever been pushed around by people like Karen. He had proven that standing up for justice could make a difference, no matter how big or small the fight. As the weeks passed after the court ruling, the transformation in Willowbrook Estates was palpable. The fear that once gripped the neighborhood had started to dissipate. Homeowners who had long been silent, who had feared retribution from Karen and her HOA, now spoke freely. They shared their stories, their frustrations, and their relief. For the first time in years, they felt they could stand tall, knowing that someone had fought for their rights. Mark watched this shift with a sense of pride. It was more than just about winning a case. It was about restoring justice to a community that had been under the thumb of someone like Karen for far too long. He had given them their voices back. The changes weren't immediate, but they were undeniable. The community came together, holding meetings, discussing ways to rebuild their sense of unity, and deciding how to prevent something like this from happening again. The HOA, now without its stronghold, had lost much of its influence. People were no longer afraid to challenge the rules that didn't make sense, and they started to work together to establish a fairer, more transparent way of managing the neighborhood. As for Karen, her life had been turned upside down. The once feared HOA president was now under investigation for the illegal activities she had carried out. She faced legal battles of her own, and her reputation, once solid in the community, was now tarnished beyond repair. Mark never took pleasure in seeing someone's downfall, but he couldn't help but feel that the consequences were a long time coming. The people she had hurt deserved justice, and they had finally gotten it. It wasn't just about the cabin or the land, it was about restoring what was rightfully theirs. Mark stood by his decision to take action, and as time passed, he felt a growing sense of peace. Willowbrook Estates was no longer the place it had been. It had become a community where neighbors trusted each other, where fairness had a chance to thrive, and where no one person could hold power over the rest. Mark smiled as he walked down the same gravel road that had been the scene of so much frustration, knowing that it was finally his to walk freely, with the weight of the past lifted off his shoulders. The battle had been hard, but it had been worth it. The road ahead was brighter, not just for him, but for everyone in Willowbrook Estates. Months went by, and life in Willowbrook Estates seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The once oppressive presence of Karen and her HOA was now just a distant memory. People walked freely down the streets, no longer burdened by the constant fear of petty fines or the threat of eviction. The community had begun to heal, and Mark watched it all with a quiet satisfaction. He often walked through the neighborhood, greeting his neighbors who now stopped to chat with him, a smile on their faces instead of the cautious glances they once gave. They had all learned the importance of standing together. It wasn't just about the victory in court, it was about the strength they found in each other. Mark had become something of a local hero, not because he sought the attention, but because he had been the one to step forward when everyone else was too afraid. He didn't see himself that way, but he could see how much his actions had changed the dynamic of the neighborhood. For the first time in years, there was a sense of community again. Mark found peace in the simple moments, sitting by the lake, watching the sun set behind the trees, or fixing up his cabin. The place that had once been a symbol of frustration now became a symbol of his triumph. His life had slowly returned to the quiet he had always longed for. His days were filled with work, but also with time for the things that mattered most: family, friends, and the land he had inherited. As time passed, the neighborhood began to thrive again. The residents, emboldened by the change, took an active role in the HOA, making sure it served the people, not the other way around. They made decisions that reflected fairness and justice, ensuring that no one would ever again feel the way they had under Karen's rule. The cabin, once a place of personal retreat, had become a symbol of resilience, of how one person's fight for justice could lead to something bigger than themselves. Mark would never forget the struggles, but he no longer felt weighed down by them. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone in Willowbrook Estates. As the seasons changed, so did the people around him. They had come together, stronger and more united, and Mark knew that this was the true victory. It wasn't just about the court ruling, it was about reclaiming their community, their peace, and their sense of justice. Years passed, and Willowbrook Estates became a place where people truly felt at home again. The community had undergone a transformation that no one had thought possible before Mark's stand. The fear that had once gripped everyone was now replaced by a sense of solidarity, a reminder that standing up for what's right could bring about real change. Mark spent his days enjoying the peace he had fought so hard for. He worked on his cabin, spending hours fixing things, making it his own. The land, once a source of constant tension, was now a symbol of everything he had worked to protect. The neighborhood meetings, once tense and filled with whispers of Karen's rule, now felt full of hope and optimism. Everyone had a voice, and they used it to make sure the community's interests came first. As Mark sat by the lake one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized how far things had come. The battle had been long, and at times, it had felt like he was fighting an uphill battle with no end in sight. But now, looking at the community he had helped rebuild, he knew that it had all been worth it. The victory wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless, to everyone who had been pushed around by those who thought they could control others. It was a victory for justice, for fairness, and for standing up for what was right. Mark had given Willowbrook Estates a future where everyone could live in peace, and that was something that couldn't be taken away. The legacy of that fight would live on, not just in the neighborhood, but in the hearts of everyone who had seen what one person could do when they refused to back down. Mark knew that the work wasn't done. There would always be challenges, always be people like Karen who would try to take advantage. But as he sat there by the lake, he understood that as long as people were willing to stand together, there was no challenge they couldn't overcome. And for the first time in years, Mark truly felt at home. He had fought for this, and now it was his to enjoy. The peace he had longed for had finally come, not just for him, but for all of Willowbrook Estates.